Richard was teaching today. If he was supposed to teach on the 22nd, but he was sick on the 22nd. We didn't actually have Sunday school on the 22nd. He was supposed to teach today and then decided that he and Martha needed to be up with Pastor and Lois to help them. So that's why you have me as a substitute teacher. Again, don't take advantage of the substitute. Don't treat me like I treated every substitute teacher when I was in school, because that would not be nice. Understandable, but not nice. Richard's first question, question number 1. Any of you ever been fired from a job? Where'd you get fired from? Oh, you don't have to tell me. Tyler, where'd you get fired from? Wow. Don Racy, who was your supervisor at Hastings Manufacturing, where you spent a good chunk of your life, fired you last night. Is this a real dream you had? I think you had too much pizza before bedtime or something. Larry? Fired from Kellogg's. Were you bad? Yeah. When did you go to Kellogg's? Yeah, so I left there in 1996. In the last couple of years I was at Kellogg's, of the 11 years I was there, became more and more uncomfortable. There was more and more pressure to work way more than a normal work week, and I could see how that was heading in that direction. Greg? Cindy? How'd this happen? Oh, I've heard stories about you as a teenager. I can see why they'd fire you. I see. That's cute. Tammy? Fired from Kmart? Well, they closed anyways. There's a case study Richard mentions. Joyce, you got fired? From the same place? Oh. Uh-huh. Yeah? I see. No real explanation. Richard gave a case study in his, there's a mention of it in his notes, and so I found it. He says, case study story, and it's question 1. George had worked for his company for 17 years when he was suddenly told he was unneeded, given a final check, and escorted to the door. After the dust settled, George discovered the company had shortchanged him in his paycheck, in reimbursement of 2 business trips, and in his retirement payout. Well, apart from legal issues, what does God's word say about a situation like this? Does God take notice? What will he do? Does God care about how employers treat their employees? Yes. Yeah. Both testaments, frankly, describe God as the avenger of those whose wages are withheld. And James, here in chapter 4, warns his readers about defrauding employees, and encourages them with godly instructions. I say in chapter 4, really chapter 5. We'll come to that employer-employee thing more in chapter 5. Let me start with chapter 4, verse 11. Phyllis wondered 3-4 weeks ago now, why didn't we cover verses 11 and 12? Well, because Richard took them, and he was saving them for the 22nd of November, and none of you were here. I know that because I came over that morning, and nobody showed up, which is good. That means you deacons did a great job of getting a hold of your people. Thank you for your help in that. I was afraid there'd be people we missed who would have showed up. Chapter 4 of James, verse 11. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's only one lawgiver and judge who is able to save and to destroy, but who are you to judge your neighbor? James here is he's warning about speaking evil or speaking ill of a brother. Can you imagine a Christian speaking evil of a fellow believer? Well, if you've been in church long enough, you can imagine that, can't you? It happens. Happens to the best of us. Sometimes because you're in a foul mood or because somebody done you wrong. All those reasons why we do that. And James makes it pretty clear that we should not do that. Richard's question 4 really is this: can you imagine a Christian talking about people behind their backs? No way. Okay, I'm being facetious now. Little sarcasm. Yeah, that's what we do, isn't it? We talk about people behind their backs. We all do it. Some of us more than others. Some people do it a lot. Some people do it just a little bit. But James makes it clear here in chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, that we ought not be speaking against our brothers. After all, you speak evil against the law. When you do that, you judge the law, and you ought not be judging the law. There's just one lawgiver, one judge who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge your neighbor? I want to think with you for a moment about Romans chapter 14. I'll invite you to turn there with me. Romans 14. It's an excellent passage about conscience and about making decisions about what to do in questionable situations. Romans chapter 14, the whole chapter would be useful for us, but I don't want to take the time this morning to read the whole chapter. But the chapter as a whole really is an excellent treatment, Romans 14, about how you decide what to do when there's disagreement about what is right. We read in our pastor's fellowship, Alex and Pastor Holmes and I, as part of Alex Madson's internship one summer, we read a book by Andy Naselli, and I can't remember the other author's first name, last name Crowley, so Naselli and Crowley. It was a book about conscience, and it was excellent. We read this in our pastor's fellowship, I think, later than that, so I've been through it twice. It's an excellent treatment about how our conscience is informed, how we come to conclusions about how to decide whether to do X or Y or Z. And sometimes there are biblical principles that guide us, and sometimes it's cultural principles that guide us, and sometimes it's love for our brother that guides us. So now, with all that in mind, Romans chapter 14, I'm just going to read verses 10, 11, and 12. He says, Paul says, why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or you, why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, every tongue shall confess to God, so then each of us will give an account of himself to God. Why are you trying to make decisions about what your brother should do? Why don't you let your brother make decisions about what he's going to do and let him stand before God? God's the judge of both his actions and his intentions. So we do much better than passing judgment on our brother to let that go and let God bring judgment on our brother. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't try and encourage my brother. And there are times where I need to be confronted. But the principle that Paul is bringing out and the principle that James would lay out here in James chapter 4 is stop speaking evil against your brother. Stop judging your brother. God is certainly capable of judging whether his actions are right or are wrong. Anything you want to add about James 4, 11, and 12 before I move to chapter 5? James chapter 5. The first 6 verses of James 5, in those verses, James confronts the rich who are taking advantage of the poor. I don't know which category you find yourself in. I don't know if you're the rich or the poor. Globally, every one of you is rich. Compared to the bulk of the population of this planet, we're all rich. Compared to the rest of the people who live in Berry County, you may find yourself on the rich side or on the poor side. Look at James chapter 5, verse 1. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, your garments are moth-eaten, your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You've laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You've fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You've condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. So Richard's question 8 asks, what did James tell those unfair rich employers to do? I know. He said the haves should share with the have-nots. Just an early form of socialism. Joe Biden would be pleased. No, that's not what he said. He said that you should show employees they are valued by paying them the wages they are due. That seems more reasonable, does it not? They have apparently withheld the wages of their laborers, and they've not been valuing the poor employees, and God has condemned that. Is that the bottom line? Show your employees that you value them by paying them their wages. In James's day, did you get your paycheck on Friday and it would have covered the pay period the previous Sunday through Saturday? No, in James's day, you got your paycheck every day. Yeah, these are daily wages that were going to be used to buy daily bread. This wasn't a matter of your checkbook had enough of a balance that you could afford not to cash last week's paycheck. This is daily sustenance that is in view here. Look at what happens to this. The rich employers have withheld wages, and look at how James describes how this has affected them. Verse 2, he says, your riches have rotted. He said, your garments have become moth-eaten. He said, your gold and silver, verse 3, has corroded. Have you ever put something away for safekeeping and found out that it wasn't safe? Give me an example, Phyllis. Yeah? Yeah. I can remember as a child when my grandpa Norton died before I was born, but my grandma Norton was alive till I was like 6, and my mother's parents were alive longer than that. But I can remember barrels of winter clothes. I can't remember if these are fiber barrels or metal barrels. They're barrels of winter clothes, like out in the garage, and there were mothballs in those barrels, and I thought, why would that makes those clothes stink something awful? Why would anybody do that? Well, that was when I figured out that apparently moths don't like paradichlorobenzene, mothballs, and they're eager to stay away from the clothes that way, because otherwise the moths eat your clothes. I have clothes hanging in my closet at home that I haven't worn for some time for various reasons. But I don't think I noticed the moths are eating them. There was a hand, but I've lost track of it. Larry, go ahead. Uh-oh. This is after you clean it? Yeah. How did that happen? Yeah. Yeah, those things that you thought were so valuable. You know, you and I, we're so used to things being fairly permanent, but not so. Any other example? Stuff you thought was safe and turned out not to be safe? All right, I'll leave that alone. The plight of the laborers, the distress of the laborers had reached God's ears. Is that a good thing? That's what he says in verse 4. The wages of the laborers who mowed your field which you kept back by fraud are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. Old Testament, Yahweh, Savaot. Is that a good thing that the cries of the laborers reached God's ears? It's good for the laborers. It's not good for the employers, is it? Yeah, it's going to be disastrous for the employers when God begins to get involved with that. We get eventually here in verses 7 and 8 to the beginning of this assurance to the poor. Go ahead. They do. And the Daniel this year was John Perkins. Tell me about John Perkins. Instead.
Instead, a white man paid him 15 cents.
Right.
And he really began then to think about economics.
Right.
15 cents for all day.
Yeah. And 15 cents not when he expected $20 an hour. 15 cents when he expected 10 times that for a day's pay, for a day's work. Yeah, you're right. The World Magazine has a Daniel of the Year every year, and this year is John Perkins. And that didn't cause him to become embittered. It caused him to become concerned about justice. Yeah. Yeah, so this is not merely a first century phenomenon. Okay. Anything else I should have asked, before we move on from verses 1 through 6? All right, verse 7, verse 8, the beginning of this assurance to the poor. Verse 7, James 5:7, be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains. You also be patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. These brothers that James says to them, be patient, I assume are the poor folks in the context of verses 1 through 5. So he gives these words of encouragement to the poor who have waited so long for justice. He says, the coming of the Lord, verse 8, is at hand. What would they expect? What would these poor people expect from the Lord at his coming if they remained patient? Wages? Probably not. I don't think we expect wages at the Lord's coming. What do we expect at the Lord's coming? Justice, that all things are made right. Yeah. I should not expect all things to be made right this side of the rapture or my death, right? I might wish, but I should not expect that. All things will be made right one day. Not necessarily in this life, but all things will eventually be made right. So he says to them, be patient. The farmer plants the seed, and immediately the crop is ready to harvest. No, the farmer plants the seed, and in time, with appropriate rain and sun and God's good work, the crop is ready to harvest. But not immediately. In the same way, justice to these poor folks is not necessarily going to come quickly, but it is going to come. It is sure. The coming of the Lord is at hand. Look with me at verse 9. Let me read 9 through 11. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remained steadfast. You've heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you've seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. So, don't grumble against one another. Who's doing the grumbling? The rich people or the poor people? The poor people. The poor people are doing the grumbling. And they've not just grumbled against their rich, unfair employers. They begin grumbling at one another. Isn't that what happens? In time, people get impatient and intolerant, and they become owly. He says, don't grumble against one another so that you don't get judged. The judge is standing at the door. And now he gives a couple of examples of suffering and patience. These two examples of suffering and patience. First of all, in verse 10, the prophets, Old Testament prophets. Old Testament prophets who were not treated especially well. They were not men who were revered in the community. When Elijah confronts Ahab about sin in the leadership of Israel, Ahab says, I really appreciate that, Elijah. Thank you for pointing that out to me. I will make sure to enact changes. No, Ahab and Jezebel are out to get Elijah. And his experience is typical of those Old Testament prophets. They were confronting sin among both the commoners and the rich and powerful people of society, and rich and powerful people don't necessarily like being confronted about their sin. And so the prophets suffered. And they are an example, James says, of those who had to suffer and be patient. The example in verse 11 is Job. Job. You and I had access to the rest of the story before we got into the story of Job, right? You and I know that Satan was walking about with the sons of God, with the angels, and God himself says to Satan, hey, what do you think about Job? Sounds like a setup. He says to Satan, what do you think about Job? And Satan says, he only loves you because you take such good care of him, because you've provided him with all these riches. God says, let's do a test. Let's see if that's true. God says to Satan, you may take his stuff away, but don't hurt him. So God proceeds to do that, takes away his stuff, not just some of his stuff, all of his stuff. And Job finds himself, having been a rich and powerful member of society, finds himself destitute. Later on, Job's not aware of all these conversations that we've read about between God and Satan. Later on, Satan is again with the sons of God, and God says to Satan again, how'd that go? How'd that go with Job? Did he curse me? Satan says, no, but that's just because you protected him. Allow me to afflict him, and he'll curse you. God says, go ahead, just don't take his life. Satan says, okay. So Satan afflicts Job personally. Next thing we see Job out on the ash heap on the edge of town, scraping the boils on his body with broken pieces of pottery in absolute agony. And Job's friends come along. And the first thing those three friends do, Bildad, Zophar, and not Elihu, Eliphaz, thank you. Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz come along. The first thing they do is sit down in the ash heap with Job and just be with him. 7 days of quietness. I got to admire that. I can't keep my mouth shut that long. I got to admire the loyalty they have for their friend Job to just sit there. But eventually they begin to speak, and once they start talking, they say stupid things, right? They're just giving Job the kind of common theology of the day, and the theology of the day was, remember, Job is living a long, long, long time ago, Abraham era. They say to Job, you must have sinned because you're enduring great difficulty. What'd you do? Job keeps saying, I don't know what I did. I've been, I think, upright. And his friends keep taking turns, Eliphaz and Zophar and Bildad. They keep taking turns criticizing Job, and Job responds. That's what the bulk of the book of Job is about. But of course, neither Eliphaz, Bildad, or Zophar, nor Job is aware of the conversations that happened between God and Satan. They don't know the cause of this. Eventually, Elihu comes along, who is a young man who has a little better perspective, but not great. He apparently doesn't quite have his ear tuned to what God's saying, but he's at least better in terms of his theology than the other three. But he continues to criticize Job, and Job continues to defend himself. Eventually, Elihu is starting to speak about a storm. You start to see the storm language cropping up in Elihu's speech. And pretty soon, God speaks out of the storm and says to Job, who are these characters that are spouting nonsense? And God brings Job to a point where Job says, you're right, I'm wrong. Stops defending himself. It felt like he should defend himself against Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu. But Job stops defending himself and recognizes that God is right in what he does. We get to the end of the story, and it all pans out. But again, Job and his friends are ignorant of the test that was going on. So Job is an example, James says, of suffering with patience. So he did suffer with patience. And you've seen, he says in verse 11, the purpose of the Lord how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. And in the end, God blesses Job again. He doesn't give him a new wife. You could wish for that. What was Job's wife's name? Beulah. Yeah, Beulah. Don't look for that in your concordance. So he's stuck with Beulah. She was a cussed old woman, but he married her. So doesn't get a new wife, but he gets new children, gets new wealth, becomes once again a man of great standing in his community. But for a long stretch there, suffering with patience. So Job is an example of that. So are the Old Testament prophets. Anything you want to add there before we move to verse 12? Verse 12 is kind of its own deal. If you're not careful, we're going to quit early. It'll be okay. You can enjoy one another's company for a bit. I don't say how early. Richard's question number 2 in the homework. Have you taken the witness stand in court and been asked to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Any of you appeared as a witness in court? Did you have to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Did it bother you to do that? Did it bother you to do that? No. I've never appeared as a witness in court, but I came close one day. Let me tell you the story. So I was a young man roofing for a living. I was up in Washington Heights in Battle Creek. I can't remember the address. I'm up there on a 2-story roof. It's steep enough that I ran one row of scaffolding along the bottom edge of the roof just so that the tools wouldn't slide off the roof and I wouldn't either. So I'm standing up there on the roof with the nail gun in my hand on the bottom plank, and I hear some commotion across the street, and there's a fella who is beating on a woman over there like a porch across the street. Everybody in the neighborhood has skin much darker than mine. We're all of the same race, human. They just have more melanin than I did. So here's this white boy up on the roof, and this guy's whooping on this girl, and I'm just standing there. I ain't never seen nothing like that before. Well, she runs away from him and goes down and bangs on a door down the street a little bit. He chases her and drags her off the porch and beats on her some more. It's a shame. It's a crime. This goes on for a few minutes. Next thing you know, you hear police sirens. And all of the people up and down the street who had been also watching this, they all go back into their houses. And when Officer Friendly shows up, who's there to have witnessed what happened? The white boy on the roof. So he came over and inquired what I had seen, and I told him the story. I may have embellished it a bit this morning, but I told him the story as I had seen it. I thought, that's it, problem solved. Next thing you know, a couple weeks later, I get a summons to appear as a witness. They'd charged this fellow with attempt to do great bodily harm less than murder. I wasn't really looking forward to testifying. The good thing is, I didn't get to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, because they pled it down to some lesser charge, and he pled guilty, and so I never appeared as a witness as you did. I just told that story to waste a little bit of time. Should a Christian take an oath to tell the truth in a court of law? Yes. Okay. Are there Christians who would not want to take an oath to tell the truth in a court of law? Yes. And they do that perhaps because they read the final verse in our passage this morning. Look at verse 12, James 5:12. But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. I don't read verse 12 to say you may not take an oath. But there are people who do, who would read verse 12 and say, I should not stand there in court and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Maybe they allow you to change some words in that. I affirm, maybe, that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, which is really the same thing as swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I don't expect that verse 12 is really designed to address what you say in court when you appear as a witness. It seems to me that in verse 12, James is commanding that we be totally honest in our everyday talk. No weasel words. No spin. We do that. We put spin on everything we say. Well, we do that because we don't trust people, because we recognize, rightly so, that you have no obligation to tell everything you know. Remember when God sent Samuel to anoint David as king over Israel? Samuel says, but Saul will kill me. And God says to Samuel, take a cow and say when you get to Bethlehem, I'm here to offer sacrifice. Is that what he was there for? Well, maybe he was going to offer sacrifice. Well, what he was really there for was to anoint David king over Israel. So there's an example, I think, of where it's clear that I don't have any obligation to tell everything I know. But there shouldn't be a weaseling out of honesty in my everyday speech. What I do say should be completely trustworthy. Again, I don't say everything I know, but what I do say should be trustworthy. You want to interact about that concept, Phyllis? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yeah, and they were happy with that. Isn't it funny? You know, frankly, to say I so affirm is no different than saying I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, is it? Yes? Yeah. It tripped you up at the time. Yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah. We were taught not to swear too, but that was because there were a handful of words we weren't supposed to say. That's what, in the Norton household, that was what swearing was. Anything else you want to add here about the truth-telling and our responsibility? Go ahead, Ron. Yes? That's right. You tell them the truth, meaning you don't lie to them, but you don't tell them everything you know for good reason. Okay? Anything else? Larry's passing out homework for next week. Hey, by the way, we're supposed to be in Hebrews today. Hebrews chapter, introduction to Hebrews today. Next Sunday, we're supposed to be in Hebrews chapter 1. That ain't going to happen because Larry's going to finish up James chapter 5. But last Wednesday's message, if you've not seen it yet, was Hebrews 1. So you can catch the missing lesson on YouTube if that's useful to you. It'll only take 22 minutes of your time as opposed to 45. So we'll pick up Hebrews again 2 weeks from today in Hebrews chapter 2. What? That was a commercial. That was a commercial about why we weren't in Hebrews already. You got a memory verse in Hebrews for December, right? Because we're supposed to be studying Hebrews, but we had to get caught up in the stuff we'd already prepared for James. And that's what Larry's passing out is material for next Sunday. Thank you, sir. You're a good man. Anything else about your yes being yes, your no being no? What did Jesus command you and I to do to other people? Love them. Love them how? Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. That'll involve paying your employees in a timely fashion what's due to them. That will involve telling the truth, letting your yes be yes, letting your no be no. Richard's bottom line on his homework handout was what? Be steadfast in adversity. Don't let adversity, have we seen adversity in 2020? Be steadfast in adversity. Don't let adversity trip you up. Be steadfast in adversity. Good counsel, I think. Any final shot? Okay, you get an extra free 10 minutes. Sorry about that. Please don't go home. Stay for the morning service if you're